everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss our recent study commissioned by the Asian Development Bank Tourism Sector Assessment for the North Pacific DMCs, including Palau, Federated States of Micronesia and Republic of Marshall Islands. My name is Jennifer Davey and I'm the Director for Horwath HTL in Sydney, and joining me today is Josephine Chong, our manager based in Singapore. As you can see from our background of assessment here, we were commissioned by the Asian Development Bank to evaluate and define the potential for new investment opportunities in Palau. So we visited in May to June, fantastic trip, thank you. And we completed some in-depth interviews with tourism stakeholders. We reviewed existing tourist experiences, and we also had the great opportunity to analyse tourism potential on Palau Island and Palau State. So when we did those interviews, we really looked into as many stakeholders as we could, including not only tourism hotel operators, but tour operators themselves. We talked to airlines, many government officials, and as that sort of evolved, we were able to really understand the environment that Palau is as a tourism destination. So today we're presenting our tourism arrivals forecasts. And the methodology that we have undertaken for this study involved four key areas. Pace of recovery, the tourism recovery in Palau, the pace of recovery after reopening of all international borders. The outlook for source markets, so that's the recovery in outbound tourism of particular source markets. The comparative benchmarks, so benchmarks that gave us a look into those opportunities that could also be considered as Palau as reliable benchmarks, and Guam and Fiji. And finally, we looked at recovery scenarios for our forecasts, and we considered frameworks and forecasts from other associations and research organisations. So if we look at tourism in recovery in Palau, the very first point is how have international border openings impacted on Palau? So post-opening of international borders, it's interesting to see which markets have rebounded. So 54% of arrivals have come from the USA and Canada since August 2021. It's very important to know that this is also made up of the American military. So that is something that is not actually categorized when we look at figures. Probably more realistic is looking at Taiwan, where 26% of arrivals have occurred since August 2021. So our key markets have been Japan, South Korea and China historically. But from the tourist arrival data, we can see that we have been very limited by any numbers in 2022. And the key issue there is international borders and how slow they are to open. So it's critical for recovery is the resumption of international flights from Japan, Korea and Taiwan, as we consider them major source markets for Palau. And the impact, whilst we work through this study and present this here, you'll see the impact of different source markets and when we anticipate them to recover. So what does the outlook look like for source markets? Typically, if we consider the Japanese market and how are they likely to return to travel, well, they are a very conservative and risk-averse market. So we anticipate they're going to have a lot longer timeline expected for recovery. They only really reopened in June 2022, so returning to pre-pandemic levels is really not likely until 2025, and we'll give and look at some of the points and reasons why that is. Now, South Korea is potentially demonstrating the fastest recovery, faster than Japanese outbound. And we consider South Korean market as a key focus for Palau's targeted marketing efforts. The best potential as they are less conservative and they're already demonstrating stronger growth trends. So based on June quarter arrivals, 26% to 2019 levels, making South Korea a very strong market for Palau. China is quite different. Historically, China was a very strong market for Palau, but this recovery is going to be delayed as Chinese continue to restrict outbound travel. Coupled with the ongoing political tension with Taiwan, we anticipate Chinese will delay a full recovery for Palau. Maybe as longer term restrictions are lifted, there might be a willingness to travel by this market. However, that will also be tempered by any ongoing situation with Taiwan. The USA is interesting. It's been a strong supporter of Palau. North America is both pandemic and post-pandemic and pre-pandemic, and it's likely to increase volume. But again, that is going to be centered around that military presence. So the challenge with source markets for Palau is that other markets such as Europe, North America and Australia, they are strong competition from other emerging, less expensive destinations. So at the moment, it's about international borders opening, air capacities and competition from re-emerging, less expensive travel options, which will really determine recovery rates for Palau. Moving on to tourism recovery, what we did is we actually considered what are some good benchmarks to look at as a demonstration of recovery. And Guam and Fiji, they are important areas to look at as areas of success. What are the success factors? So the pace of recovery in Guam, for instance, is quite different to the pace of recovery in Fiji when we look at PARTA forecasts. So PARTA projections for Guam indicated that there's been a slower recovery pace than projected, particularly due to the Japanese delay in reopening. In comparison, Fiji demonstrated a very strong recovery, and a lot of that has to do with direct flights, access, returning, and very strong source markets. We have Australia, New Zealand and USA, very strong supporters of Fiji markets. And a lot of that is a level of safety as well, ease of access. So expectations of 45% of 2019 arrivals for 2022 for Fiji. So we also need to look at the fact that Fiji has a very well established market position with tourism. It has accommodation and a lot of brands to choose from. It's well supported by F&B options throughout these brands. And it's important that Palau considers this when building a tourism industry, that they look to benchmarks such as Fiji and how they have built their existing tourism infrastructure. We then considered, as part of our study, third-party framework and forecasts. So we looked at available forecasts from PARTA. We reviewed these forecasts against actual visitation to date. We also considered Oxford Economics and the International Air Transport Association data from IATA. So we just mentioned, Fiji is a great benchmark, and you can see it's actually performing better than the PARTA projections. So it's a really good example for other markets such as Vanuatu, Samoa and the Cook Islands. It's important to know that these destinations do rely on Australia and New Zealand, and they have a very long historical association. And there's a willingness by Australians to get back and support these destinations, and from New Zealand as well. Guam, in comparison, is currently behind PARTA forecasts. We believe it's the lack of Japanese arrivals as the key factor that's slowing this recovery, and it's unlikely to reach 2019 volumes until 2024. CNMI is also likely to do better than Guam with South Korea, likely to uplift and assist where the Chinese market has slowed there. So where does Palau sit? Palau sits at only 9% of 2019 volumes as at year-to-date June, although they did show some signs of improved recovery in the June quarter 2022, with tourist arrivals representing 14% of 2019 volumes. Really, in order to reach the PARTA forecast for Palau of 46% of 2019 tourism arrivals for 2022, Palau would need to capture 86% of arrival volume for the period to December 22. Now that is very unlikely to happen. Unfortunately, when we also look at the IATA forecasts of air passenger volumes, we can see that all three regions are forecast to be recovered to 2019 passenger volumes by 2025, but the pace of recovery is going to be quite different. The Asia-Pacific region is likely to be the slowest pace of recovery. It is lagging behind Europe and North America, particularly 22 and 23, before making up ground in 24 and 25. We expect Asia-Pacific region have passenger volumes reach 68% of 2019 levels, increasing to 84% of 2019 volumes by 2023. So it's worth noting that these are for total passenger volumes, domestic and international. And in fact, the outlook for international passenger volumes for Asia Pacific could in fact be lower than these numbers. So from all this data, what we can conclude is that international passenger volumes across Asia Pacific are really not expected to recover for at least 3 years and may not reach 2019 volumes until 2026. Continuing to our estimated growth forecasts. So in estimating Palau's tourism arrival recovery from COVID-19, we considered the following. The Chinese market is unlikely to return to outbound travel in 2022, based on the fact that the Chinese government slow to open up its borders, and they also may seek to limit travel to markets that don't have an approved destination status. So this is very much going to slow recovery for Palau. Horwath HTL forecasts anticipate Chinese market will return in 2023, maybe getting growth rates similar to that of South Korea to date that have been travelling to Guam and CNMI. Now, Japanese market, similarly, it's going to have a slow recovery and it's not going to return to pre-pandemic levels, maybe only by 2025. And again, that's due to that risk-averse nature of Japanese travellers. Palau has not really been able also to capture the initial outbound South Korean traveller return to Guam and CNMI. They haven't been able to capture that same level of recovery, but we do expect by the end of 23, South Korea arrivals will return to 2019 levels. And again, the US market demonstrates that fully recovered, exceeding pre-pandemic levels in 2023, remembering, of course, its military involvement driving some of that arrivals. So the issue for Palau is really a consideration that airlines are likely to prioritise profitable routes first. So they're going to be looking at sufficient passenger volume routes, so prior to travel anywhere such as a destination like Palau. So that airline capacity, which Josephine will also talk about, is really very important. Our estimated growth scenarios, we looked at 3 scenarios, a low, medium and high growth versions when we estimated growth of tourism arrivals in Palau. Our low scenario, we assessed a long-term growth average for Palau by calculating a compound average annual growth rate over a 10-year period between 2009 and 2019. Tourism arrivals over this 10-year period grew at a rate of 2.8%. Therefore, we applied this average growth rate from 2026 through to 2030. And we estimated the longer term increase in the volume of tourism arrivals. So our arrivals are forecast to reach about 110,800 by 2030. While calculations are made on a simple straight line basis for this scenario, it really recognises that there are likely to be years of strong growth, followed by years of decline, with a net result being an overall longer term moderate growth of 2.8%. The next scenario that you can see here is our mid scenario, where we return to moderate historical levels. So from 2011 to 2018, Palau recorded above 100,000 visitor arrivals. In assessing a midpoint forecast of arrivals, what that might look like, we calculated the average arrivals over this time, which amounted to about 126,000. And we allowed for visitor arrivals to increase to this number by 2028. Following which growth rates in 2029 and 2030 have been moderated. So finally, we have the arrival peak, the high scenario. So our high growth scenario sees Palau returning to peak tourism volume numbers of 160,900, with growth from 2025 onwards, effectively matching the decline that was recorded between 2015 to 2019. As such, the previous peak is matched again in 2029. So the growth in 2030 is set to match the rate set between 2025 to 2030 at 14.2%. So tourism arrivals are basically estimated to reach 187,000 by 2030. The above 3 scenarios have been based on historical data points, averages and trends in visitor arrivals to Palau. They're intended only to provide an outline to the potential for future tourism arrival growth. So the actual growth recorded in the coming years will be driven by the improvement to Palau's tourism offering, looking at benchmarks, how well they operate over a long-term development for infrastructure and products such as accommodation and tour operations, as well as local economic and political conditions, and importantly, the access of key source markets and their likelihood to return. But very importantly is obviously the reliance on foreign airlines and that seat capacity to gain entrance to Palau as a destination. So the priorities of airlines regarding the routes they prioritise moving out of the pandemic will heavily influence the ability of Palau to return to growth in tourism arrivals. Thanks. I'll pass on to Josephine, who will discuss destinations and the performance against some of the benchmarks.
Thank you, Jennifer. So in terms of the destinations comparison, we took a look at 13 Pacific Island nations in the region, and that includes Palau. And we also evaluated 3 key areas of importance when we assess the status of the tourism industry within island destinations. So having a look of our methodology, the 3 key aspects are in terms of air seat capacity, tourism arrivals and source markets, and accommodation supply. So in terms of seat capacity, it is evaluated based on volume. The share by largest carrier, it's a matter of the percentage share of the largest carrier in proportion to the rest, because it minimizes the risk of changes in air capacity. So the lower the percentage is better. And the third component we look at is the reliance on a single source market. So the lower the share is also better. And of course, the last component is just a matter of whether there is a local carrier or not. For the second key aspect on tourism arrivals, we look at the total visitor arrivals. So that's based on volume. The second one is the proportion of the largest source market relative to the total arrivals. So the lower is better. And the last one is on the economic impact of tourism, which we feel that the higher the industry is, it reflects their importance for the destinations. And the third key aspect we look at is in terms of accommodation supply. So first one, room supply, it's also based on volume, the higher the better. The second component is on the mix of rooms by star ratings. So there are 3 broad categories that we looked at. So rooms that is ranked 4.5 stars and above, rooms that is ranked from 3 to 4 stars, and rooms that is ranked 3 stars and below. So it is important to have a mix across all these 3 categories. And then the third component we look at is the share of branded rooms within the market. And the last component is whether there is international branded hotels in the destination or not. So for the first air seat capacity assessment, you will see how the structure is that the ranking criteria is on the left, all the 13 destinations is on the top right, and Palau is always the very first destination to be evaluated. So take a look at Palau. So in 2019, to provide some context, Fiji's air seat capacity was at 1.4 million seats, while Palau one was only at 140,000, only about 10% of that of Fiji. And of course, we could see that in terms of local carrier, Palau is ranked poorly because there is none. And here is a look at the rest of the island destinations, and our conclusions is in the next slide. So we could see that across all 13 destinations, Fiji fared the best. They had the largest seat capacity, which amounted to 48% of total seats for the region. One main reason is that it's supported by their own local carrier, Fiji Airlines, and they also had the largest capacity, which is 36% of all seats for the region. To provide some context, the second country with the highest air seat capacity is Samoa, but it's only at 289,000 seats. So that's the huge disparity with Fiji itself. And of course, if you look at source markets, the biggest source market was Australia, about 30%, and New Zealand at about 29%. But if we put it in context, these are the two top source markets for Fiji. So we could see that the acid capacity and the source market definitely has a correlation. And only 5 out of the 13 Pacific Island nations had their own carriers servicing international destinations. So the second aspect of tourism arrivals and source markets, we could see again, Palau scored good for all the components. And if you look at other destinations, Fiji was the only island destination to score excellent in terms of the total visitor arrivals and the economic impact. And it's just a factor of the sheer volume of tourism industry for Fiji itself. And the gray boxes indicate that there was no available information for Nauru and Nui. So again, Fiji scored the best. They attracted a total of 56% of total arrivals, and that can translate to about 870,000 tourism arrivals. And for Palau, it was only at about 106,000 arrivals. And there were only 4 destinations that recorded arrivals in excess of 100,000. So that's Samoa, Cook Islands, Vanuatu, and Palau. And that's in addition to Fiji itself. And Palau scored well. There is less reliance on a single source market. So for Palau, the largest source market in 2018 is China, and that amounted to about 39% of total arrivals. And if you look at in terms of economic impact, Fiji again, another standout, contributing about 931 million US dollars, while Palau was only about 170 million US dollars. And of course, the largest source markets was Australia, New Zealand, and USA. The only exception was Palau, with China as the largest source market, and Tuvalu with Fiji as the largest source market. And for the last key aspect we evaluated was in terms of accommodation supply. So looking at Palau, you could see that Palau actually scored poor for 2 out of the 4 components. And this fared less worse than the other 2 key aspects that we have already touched on. But if you look at the rest of the island destinations, that's unfortunately not unusual. Most of them actually scored very poorly. And in particularly Nauru and Tuvalu scored the worst, having poor across all components. In the case for Nauru, they only had properties in the 3 to 4 star rating, and Tuvalu only had properties that were ranked 3 star and below. So in conclusion, so 9 out of the 13 Pacific Islands scored poor for at least 2 criteria. But for Palau, it's considered to have a moderate mix of properties, but no international brands. And Fiji again scored excellent in all the criteria. So Fiji had a total of 9,000 rooms, and that was amounting to 46% of all the rooms in the region. And Palau only had about 2,000 rooms. And again, in terms of the split of the categories that were looked at, we could see for the highest rating category, 80% of the supply came from Palau, while the largest proportion of the rooms in the region was in the 3 to 4 star rating, amounting to about 62% of total supply. And only 3 Pacific Islands had international branded properties, and that is Fiji, Vanuatu, and Samoa. And we do note that Tonga do have their domestic regional brands. So what are some key takeaways for Palau itself? So in terms of acid, it's 7 out of 13. We could see that because of the low population base, there is a reliance on tourism to build up the supply for air demand, but it does have a balanced supply of seats and distribution of source markets. In terms of tourism arrivals, it's ranked 5th. There is, again, a balanced source market, but our observation is that there has not been any historical evidence that Palau is able to drive higher volumes from any singular source origin market. And in terms of accommodation supply, although Palau is ranked third, please remember that they actually do score poorly for 2 out of the 4 criteria. And more importantly, we noted that the accommodation supply is at a proportion to its volume of air seat capacity and tourism arrivals. So in actual performance, we know that a lot of properties, they actually have low occupancies and financially unsustainable. And of course, there is a lack of highly rated properties and branded accommodations.
Great, thanks, Joe, for that review. Our study also highlighted a lot of investment opportunities in all accommodation categories and also in tour operator categories. And we've detailed these extensively for the ADB within this report. So when this report is finalised, which we are undertaking right now, and with the approval of the ADB, we'd be happy to further discuss these outcomes with any relevant stakeholders, of course. So thanks again for the opportunity to present today. We do miss the beautiful natural environment and people that define your wonderful country, Palau. And we really, both Joe and I, hope to see you in person sometime soon. Thanks again.
Thank you for having us.